Alright, hey guys, welcome back to Internet Tomato, where we will be diving into the dark, twisted, and epic lore of Tainted Grail. I shall be your guide in unraveling the mysteries of Avalon. Today, we are continuing our lore series by going over the first days on Avalon, leading to the beginning of the Age of Legends. This video aims to provide a balanced introduction for new players and fans alike, ensuring everyone walks away with more knowledge. Keep in mind that the lore is still developing, as Tainted Grail has games planned for the future to supplement what we already know, and things are somewhat subject to change. Also, if you wouldn't mind, please like and subscribe, or you might just get turned into a menhir. So, let's get into this. Last we left off, we discussed Arthur's exodus from Camlann and the first steps on Avalon. In the latest Fall of Avalon update, it was confirmed that Morgaine and Kai are two different people. Thankfully, I guessed that correctly when Kai entered the scene, but I probably have spoken wrong in earlier lore videos. I hope you can understand. In the Discord, which I'd love for you to join, I asked who you think was the unnamed knight or captain who returned to Camlann and pretended to be Arthur. It looks like you are rather split, but the idea of a fetch, which is a shapeshifter, seems to be strongly considered. I personally don't know, but I like to think that it was Sir Kay, Arthur's brother, who was always jealous of Arthur. Almost poetically, he would have finally fulfilled his dreams and ruled from the dying Camlann. Keep in mind, as I get into the video, that before the 4th year on Avalon, the lore is a little bit light. Summoning the fleet ashore was a challenge in of itself. Attempting the landing, many of the ships were unable to withstand the crashing waves and treacherous waters. The currents naturally led the ships to their doom. Much of the southern Avalonian shore would have been impossible to land on, but that which was hospitable had been packed with boats of various makes, sizes, and origins. When the land was covered, the remaining ships would anchor near the beach and connected together with ropes and nailed down planks. The soldiers, knights, and adventurers likely would have been found on the beach organizing the braver populace while carefully exploring the island for hunting grounds and farmland. A pier was being constructed to aid in future landings, and everyone was either hard at work or busy planning. The land was rocky and the seas were dangerous. Two majestic rocks face the fury of the sea, standing side by side like a pair of patient guardians. Seabirds favor the unreachable tops, safe from both weirdness and predators. The location was called the Twin Sisters, named after the two giant rock faces. Despite the voyage, which lasted several weeks, most were leery of the idea of living within the range of the mist, especially so close to the bizarre and alien giant wall of porous stone looming in the distance. I would expect Merlin's druid apprentices, the Knights of the Round Table, and members of the Royal Geographers would have worked hand in hand, trying to both map out this place and test the waters. I can only imagine the terror that the first explorers must have felt, seeing the footprints of giants, the trails of giant worms, and the warped visages of weird bears. Then, to feel the conflicting emotions of dread and wonder at seeing graveyards and ruins. With every new discovery, the imposing presence of Tuathan's walls shadowed over them. What kind of place was this? As day gave way to night, the mysterious mist expanded and became volatile. Creatures roamed the fog, and though it was less present at the beach, those in the thick of it were being affected. They acted incoherently, some even feeling a draw to venture into the weirdness. A person's worst fears were made manifest within the fog. When morning came, the people were perturbed. This landing was a mistake. People were getting severely affected by the mist, and the soil was ill-suited for farming. The dangers and logistics made this place inhospitable for humanity. Using explorers like the Royal Geographers and scout ships, Arthur hunted for a better home, perhaps a place where the weirdness barely touched it, or didn't touch at all. With the dangers of Avalon and balancing between rationing and starvation, humanity survived likely through fishing, but it wasn't enough for the long term. Eventually, a place was spotted. Not far from the first landing, there was a portion of land to the east where the weirdness was light and appeared to have good soil. The farming community knew that they had wasted enough time for the crops to grow for the following harvest, and urged Arthur to move quickly. Having lost several ships and lives already on the landing, the choice was tough to give up on the twin sisters. But Arthur decided it was for the best. The ships launched, heading along Avalon's shores to the east to the next landing. Before them was a giant mangrove tree, its roots extending extremely far and providing enough room for nearly the entire fleet to take shelter underneath. Sending the ships under the mangrove tree would have been extraordinarily dangerous, and there was no telling how deep or shallow the mangrove's roots went. However, Arthur didn't want humanity to be forced to slog several miles in the weirdness, as the monsters that had been spotted so far were able to best some good soldiers already. Marching tens of thousands of civilians for a week in thick weirdness wasn't an option, leaving just one choice: sending the fleet into the cover of this giant tree. He knew most of the fleet would become wreckages, but it appeared to be the only option left. Arthur gave the order, and the hundreds of ships sailed into the mangrove cove. The hulls creaked with ear-wrenching screeches as one by one the ships halted by the land. The cove was quickly packed, and the ships on the outside formed a ring around the mangrove tree, again tied together with ropes and nailed together with planks as they set anchor. The sea cannot be glimpsed in this sheltered cove. Anchored ships filled it edge to edge, making it possible to walk from one end to the other with dry feet. The outermost line of ships serves as an improvised wooden wharf, allowing fishing boats and smaller transport craft to dock to this immobile armada. Though it had only been a few months since the Red Death began back in Camlan, humanity felt hopeful for the first time in what felt like ages. The horrors of the Red Death were all but gone. The land was suitable for farming, and the weirdness had given the area a wide enough berth for both the monsters and the weirdness's ill effects to be minimal. Humanity found its home. Farmers began planting their crops as fishermen began finding good fishing spots. Hunters traveled in groups and tried to stay near civilization as they searched for plentiful hunting grounds. King Arthur got architects and builders to work on a marvel, Tintagel. Tintagel was to be a giant circular citadel with no gate. Entering Tintagel required a large crane to carry in both people and supplies. The outer wall was made of stone, but the mortar to seal the walls was likely an invention by Merlin. The mortar paste possibly used a mixture of clay, human blood, and dust. Life essence, human blood, appeared to be a repellent to the weirdness. individuals would have to practice bloodletting to aid in the construction. The reason I presume the mortar has blood will be mentioned later in the video. King Arthur created this citadel with urgency and discussed the construction as though planning for sieges. But who would siege Tintagel? Despite their efforts, starvation was still a grave concern. Even with fertile soil, fishing spots, and hunting grounds, there wasn't enough to go around. Little did humanity know that Avalon was stirring. The geographers continued to explore the land, trying to map it out, but routinely came across monsters. Several times, the knights, druids, and possibly Arthur himself ventured into the weirdness to slay all manner of giant beasts and worms. Tintagel was being built quickly and was used as their capital and headquarters. As the weeks dragged on, the concern about food grew. Likely around this time, as the people realized that they had too many mouths to feed, the Red Death survivors came to the forefront. Most who survived the Red Death had been left permanently afflicted with a leprosy-like state, and though the Red Death was very rarely transmitted from those in that state, it still happened from time to time with prolonged exposure. Many would have voiced that the survivors of the Red Death were only a drain on resources. To settle the matter, Arthur ordered that those afflicted be sent east to live in a Red Death colony within the dark morass, a swamp with a nauseating vapor choking the air. Though to the sick this was seen as a death march, the Red Church and Kai went with them to set up an asylum. The Church and Kai took in everyone, the sick, the hungry, and the downtrodden. Kai did her best to keep everyone in her care alive, but that would prove impossible. In the coming months, nearly 2/3 of the entire human population on Avalon died, mostly from starvation. Those who survived were disgruntled, as Arthur's demand for the construction of Tintagel seemed misguided. In the second year, the food crisis had mostly been averted, but beyond Tuathan's walls, the Fore-dwellers stirred. Tintagel was easy to spot for the Fore-dwellers, as the weirdness no longer provided them visual cover, as it did in the Twin Sisters. To the Fore-dwellers, this was an invasion from the underworld. A Fore-dweller army mobilized, planning to push humanity back to the seas, as they did to the Fomorians in the Last Age. To the Fore-dwellers, they viewed humanity as strictly inferior. Humanity could not control the weirdness. They were weakened through starvation, and they were half a Fore-dweller's size. A regiment of Tuathan guards ventured into Avalon, leaving Tuathan walls. They likely took weeks to reach Tintagel. The Fore-dwellers were hulking giants, about 10 to 15 feet in height. They wielded shields, axes, swords, spears, slings, and were covered head to toe in weird steel armor. The Fore-dwellers were aggressive. They used the weirdness as a magical force to ripple the air and slay their foes. The civilians scattered as Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table, the Druids, and Tintagel's army faced the new nemesis. The way these four-armed beings could wield the weirdness was terrifying, and it became clear that a single Fore-dweller could have been a match for an entire rank of foot soldiers. Arthur, having been a veteran of dozens of skirmishes, sieges, and battles, was able to organize his troops from the sudden assault. Though many soldiers died or ran in terror, the Fore-dwellers were slain. The knights and Arthur had a kinship in battle that the Fore-dwellers were not ready for, and they paid the price. Editing Tomato here. Sorry for this kind of a jump. I'm not scripted here, so I'm sorry if I don't sound as professional, but there were 3 things that I wanted to mention that I forgot to, one of which I think is rather important. Merlin, after landing by the mangrove tree, ended up writing down protective runes on the roots of the tree. What it did was create a magical barrier that extended a pretty large ways and protected the 3 flagships that Arthur brought over. The intention of this was to create a very quick getaway. I think that was the intention, so that if the 4 dwellers ended up being too much, they would be able to run to the flagship and get out of there. Only they knew the way to break the barrier. The other thing to mention is that Merlin ended up casting some kind of a magical spell to push back the weirdness in the area. Although it was already better than the original landing, this was just to ensure, more than likely, to ensure that the crops were able to thrive here. The other thing they did want to mention is that this is my best guess as to how the first landings went down. The reason I'm saying this is because in the board game, it is described differently than the video game. I'm trying to figure out how exactly to reconcile the 2 different tellings. On one hand, Seawolf Firstfoot is considered the first person to land on Avalon, hence the name. He is a somewhat important character in the video game. In the board games, however, it feels quite clear that it was Arthur, and Arthur only brought troops. However, this seems to have been retconned a little bit in the Red Death expansion. So my assumption then, which I should have explained in the video, is that when Arthur moved the fleet from the Twin Sisters to the mangrove tree, he likely took himself as well as some troops to clear out the area with Merlin. They set up a small fort to help the civilians on and off the boats, and then they started to set up Tintagel. They then moved the civilians to the mangrove tree, and then the rest is history. The people flooded Arthur with questions. Though he hid knowing of the 4 dwellers' strong presence on Avalon, he assured the people that he would protect them by any means necessary. Unknown to the people, the Pale Lady continued to commune with him. She was an advisor, and many of the knights were frustrated with him, taking her advice to heart. The Pale Lady was also attempting to teach Arthur how to control the weirdness with his will, but this was a well-kept secret. The construction of Tintagel was necessary for the defense of humanity, and now the people were thankful that Arthur pushed its construction as he did. For most of the second year, Tintagel was attacked, ambushed, and besieged. It appears that the 4 dwellers struggled to dismantle Tintagel despite their strong control of the weirdness. This is why I am presuming the mortar used in the construction of Tintagel had blood in its makeup, as life essence appears to repel the weirdness. In a dark anecdote in the Fall of Avalon board game, a man is described as using mortar made of blood to seal himself at night in Avalon to guard against the weirdness. I assume that if blood was able to repel the weirdness, perhaps it was also capable of preventing the 4 dwellers from disassembling Tintagel. This is strictly speculation, to be clear, but regardless, the 4 dwellers sent larger and larger armies to besiege Tintagel, hoping to wipe humanity off the map. Siege after siege, battle after battle, humanity won Pyrrhic victories. The casualties mounted high, and the sieges happened so often that Tintagel no longer cleaned the aftermath. Ah, Tintagel, the only place in the whole of Avalon that humans can confidently call their own. Smoke and steam rise from within the round fort, as if it was a giant squat chimney. There is no gate. Instead, a pair of large cranes haul people in and out for a couple of coppers. Outside the wall, buildings are light and temporary. Everyone knows another siege may come at any moment, wiping out everything beyond the walls of the fort. The remnants of old battlefields, full of broken weapons, horse bones, and scattered pieces of armor, are a constant reminder. In the third year, the sieges continued, and the Four-Dwellers sent larger varieties of troops. They no longer just sent regiments of Tuathan guards, it was now hordes of Four-Dweller wretches, Tuathan stake-slingers, wielding crossbow-like weaponry, warcasters with a mastery in manipulating the weirdness, and reclaimers, the most elite of the Tuathan troops. They were organized, and Tuathan seemed to pop out these Four-Dwellers like a machine. They first came in the hundreds, and now they were coming in the thousands. With every loss, the Four-Dwellers may have regrouped for a time, but they would return with a larger army with more advanced training and weaponry. Likely after a successful defense of Tintagel, Arthur was confronted by a knight who was afflicted with the Red Death, and an ex-soldier named Thibault. The two requested that the men of fighting age who have the Red Death be allowed to join Tintagel's army. Arthur agreed, and the Red Shields were born, led by the knight and Thibault. Adding them to Tintagel's ranks proved helpful, as those with the Red Death did not have a fear of dying and were known to never falter on the field. Still, this was not enough for the constant onslaught. Either in the second or third year, Arthur sent messenger ships to the homelands. They were dispatched to all the strongest kingdoms that may have survived the Red Death plague. Arthur wrote missives promising riches to sellswords in countries, claiming the land he discovered was drowning in rare materials. Greed won out for many of these petty kings and mercenaries. Several ships of reinforcements sailed to Avalon. The last thing to mention is that possibly around this time, though it may have happened when the Round Table was first founded, there was an obsession with immortality. The Round Table had stuck together and overcome the insurmountable. However, whether because of battle, old age, or sickness, the knights would begin dying out. Sir Kay, Arthur's half-brother, had already either died or disappeared. Sir Tristan had been long dead, and many others had died or were severely wounded. The way to keep the Round Table alive with these knights who held on so dearly to honorable virtues was to have successors. After one died, another would take his place, inheriting the title of Sir Kay, Sir Tristan, or whichever knight had recently passed. They decided the Druids would be the ones to elect the next knight through casting votes. Now, the explanation is rather vague, since how the election works is left pretty much at that, but I would like to provide a theory. It is established that Arthur has soul fragments tied to his dearest belongings on Avalon. In addition, in a future part of the lore set almost 1,000 years later, there's a situation where the Pale Lady is searching for a man who is both from the homelands and exemplified strong character. Basically, she finds Sir Lancelot, supposedly the original Sir Lancelot, who was born in the homelands. What confuses me is that it is clear that people are elected after a knight dies, and Lancelot was definitively killed around the Age of Legends. In fact, you see his spirit in his tomb at one point. To me, the way to reconcile all the details, which I could very well be wrong, is that when a new knight is elected, a piece of the soul of the old knight is transferred to the new. Perhaps the Druids are the ones who elect the knights because they are the ones capable of binding the souls of the true knights with those elected. So, in a way, when Lancelot is met in the future, the Pale Lady is right to believe a part of him was once born in the homelands. This method was different from the plans for Arthur. Merlin wanted Arthur to be strictly immortal, He didn't want to risk binding a part of Arthur's soul to someone elected, as typically, the elected individual is not significantly influenced by the soul of the true knight when bound. Instead, he tested methods of making Arthur and the true knights who still were alive immortal. If it was not possible to make Arthur immortal, they planned to resurrect him only under dire circumstances, as resurrections tended to eat away at the soul. As you can imagine, that kind of research would take some time. Merlin and his druid apprentices, including Orin and Nimue, were hard at work. For the time being, Tintagel patiently waited for reinforcements from the homelands. In the next lore video, we'll dive into the famed Age of Legends, but for now, please like, subscribe, join our Discord for random polls and Tainted Grail chats. So, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you guys have a great day, and I hope to see you guys in the next one. So yeah, see you later. Bye-bye.